Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at how Denmark was governed in the first half of the 18th century. We saw how the personalities and whims of absolute monarchs turned the country into a stale and rather boring place. Politically, Denmark was in a bit of a slump, since the realization was finally sinking in that the provinces east of the Øresund Strait were definitely lost to Sweden. Ironically though, Denmark experienced a golden age of trade and commerce at the same time. Today, we'll explore a big reason for that, namely the establishment of Danish colonies all over the globe. We'll also have a look at a somewhat less successful Swedish colonial project. Episode 107, Colonialism. When we think of colonialism, we usually think of the Spanish, British, or French empires. But the governments in Copenhagen and Stockholm also dreamed of overseas riches, and Denmark and Sweden participated in the European colonization of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Today, we'll look at Scandinavian attempts to establish colonies here and there all over the world, from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. The Danes were first out of the gate. It was Christian IV who kicked off their modern post-Viking Age colonial projects. In case you've forgotten who Christian IV was, there are so many Danish kings called Christian after all, he was the one who dabbled a bit in the 30 Years' War, but was soon overshadowed by Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. Christian IV is also the king who renamed Oslo after himself, and he's commemorated in the Danish royal anthem, if you remember the tune about a King Christian who stood in smoke and mist while killing Swedes. Anyway, Christian IV was very interested in increasing the crown's revenue streams, perhaps because he was so good at spending money. He tried to encourage commercial activities in all the ways that were fashionable in the first half of the 17th century. For instance, by granting monopolies on foreign trade to a handful of Danish cities and establishing trading companies with monopolies on trade with Iceland, Greenland, and East Asia. As you may remember, Denmark had lost the connection to the colonies in Greenland all the way back in episode 54. But Christian IV made attempts to re-establish that connection, not knowing that the old Scandinavian settlements in Greenland had died out. Between the years 1605 and 1607, King Christian sent a number of expeditions across the Atlantic Ocean in an attempt to find out what had happened to the Scandinavians who lived there. He also wanted to remind them that they were subjects to the Danish crown and that their taxes were way overdue. Not much came of these expeditions though, mostly because it had been so long since anyone had traveled to Greenland that no one remembered where exactly the Scandinavian settlements were located. And since Greenland is a pretty big place, there are a lot of places to look. It didn't exactly help that they were looking for the eastern settlement on the east coast of Denmark. As you may remember from when we talked about the Viking journeys across the Atlantic, the Scandinavians had settled on the west coast of Greenland, but confusingly, they called their colonies there the Western and Eastern Settlement, instead of the northern and the southern ones, which would have made more sense. So these early 17th century Danish expeditions were looking in vain for traces of Scandinavian life on the east coast of Greenland, just north of the southern tip of the island. Their searches were made even more difficult by the fact that it's well nigh impossible to navigate this stretch of coast because of a steady supply of icebergs drifting southward with the ocean currents from the North Pole. So they had to return to Denmark empty-handed. Not that they'd found any potential taxpayers, even if they had been looking in the right places. The only humans living in Greenland in the early 1600s were the ancestors of the current Inuit population of the island. They had reached northern Greenland around the year 1300. From there, they moved south and eventually came into contact with the Scandinavians who already lived in the southwest. It's unclear what role, if any, the Inuit played in the extinction of the old Scandinavian settlement in Greenland. But once the Scandinavians were all dead, the Inuit controlled the whole island. For over 100 years, the Inuits were left in peace. But even though the Danes had forgotten where exactly their ancestors had lived, they hadn't forgotten that Greenland was a part of the Danish kingdom. at least nominally. A new attempt to re-establish a more concrete hold over the island was done in 1721. A new expedition was sent to Greenland, led by a Norwegian-born priest called Hans Egede, who was eager to spread Protestantism on the island. But the expedition wasn't just a religious mission. It had the dual purpose of saving the souls of the population of Greenland and establishing profitable trading links between the island and the mother country. To that end, Hans Egede established the Greenland Trading Company. With time, the Danes established a number of trading posts. For example, Christians Hope, on the west coast in 1734. Today that settlement is called Kasig-Yanguit, which in the Greenlandic Inuit language means the small spotty seals, or so I'm told. In 1741, Jakobshavn, or Jacob's Port, followed. Today it's known as Ilulissat, or the icebergs. The following year, Frederikshope, or Frederikshope, was established. Its current name is Pamut, which means by the river mouth. The 1750s saw the establishment of Fiskeneset, or the fishing peninsula, today known as Kekertarsuatsiat, meaning the fairly large islands, and Holsteinsborg, currently Sisimiut, which apparently means those who live by the foxholes. In 1760, 2 years after Hans Egede's death, his son Paul established a settlement he called Egedesminne, or Egedes Memorial. Its name has been changed to Asiat, which apparently means spiders. Spiders are a rare sight in Greenland, but they're said to bring good luck in Inuit mythology, so I assume that's the explanation. By the way, I have absolutely zero knowledge of how to actually pronounce any of these current Inuit names. Those were just my wild guesses based on the spelling. I apologize to any Inuit listeners who were offended by my butchering of their language. If you have any knowledge of how these names should be pronounced, please don't hesitate to send me instructions, or even better, a recording of how they should be pronounced. All these new trading posts connected to the main settlement on the new Danish colony in Greenland, namely the town of Gottorp, or Good Hope, today known as Nuuk on the southwest coast, not very far from the original Viking settlements. Nuuk is still the capital of Greenland, and today it has a population of some 20,000 inhabitants, which is about a third of the total population of the island. After 15 years in Greenland, Hans Egede sailed back to Denmark in 1735. His son Paul stayed and took charge of the missionary activities. Back in Denmark, Hans was instrumental in the establishment of the Greenland Seminary, which was a part of King Frederick IV's attempt to spread Christianity in all the Danish territories, such as Greenland and India, but also among the Sami in northern Norway. Even with Hans Egede gone, Greenland remained under Danish control, and even though the island has enjoyed home rule since 1979, it's still a part of the Kingdom of Denmark to this day. At least, it still was when I recorded this episode in early May 2025. I mean, Donald Trump hasn't exactly made a secret of his desire to turn this mineral-rich island into a US territory, so we'll see what happens in the next few years. About a decade after he sent those ships off to Greenland to look for the lost Scandinavian settlements, Christian IV of Denmark sent an expedition in the opposite direction, to Southeast Asia. In 1620, King Christian acquired a small colony on the southeastern coast of India called Tranquebar. Christian IV was influenced by an economic school of thought known as mercantilism, which was quite popular in the 1600s. The idea is basically that a country should have a trade surplus compared to other countries, exporting more than it imports, creating a positive balance of trade, thereby hoarding resources. It was believed that this increased the wealth of the national economy at the expense of one's neighbors and competitors. In the last few centuries, this theory has been largely abandoned by economists who no longer see the global market as a zero-sum game. Today, most serious economists instead point to a growing economy as a win-win situation for everyone involved, and that capitalism thrives in a global market characterized by free trade and no or low tariffs. But King Christian, much like most other leaders of budding colonial powers at that time, thought that in order for Denmark not to be harmed by the import of desirable goods from Asia, such as spices, porcelain, tea, and luxury fabrics, they should be brought to Denmark via Danish trading posts in the Far East. The Danes weren't the first people to reach Tranquebar, though. People had been living there at least since the early 14th century. In fact, they weren't even the first Europeans. A few decades before the Danes showed up and made a deal with the local Indian leaders to gain access to Tranquebar in 1620, the Portuguese had set up a Jesuit mission there, and many of the local Tamil fishermen were already Catholics. The focal point of the Danish colony of Tranquebar was a fort called Fort Dansborg. It was quite an extensive defensive position. In fact, it's the second largest fortification ever built by Danish authorities after the castle Kronborg in Helsingør. That's the castle that controlled the shipping lane in and out of the Baltic Sea through the Øresund Strait. Construction of the fort started immediately after the Danes took control of Tranquebar in 1620. According to some sources, the local Catholic Church was demolished in the process, which, if it wasn't an expressed goal, at least would have been seen as a positive side effect by the fiercely Protestant Danes. From Fort Dansborg, the governor would rule the Danish colony of Tranquebar for about 150 years. The purpose of the colony in India was never to bring over masses of people and to create a settlement populated by Danes. No, the whole point was to generate money for the crown through trade. But not much money was forthcoming, so in 1639 the increasingly impatient Christian IV sent a Dutchman called Willem Lale to Tranquebar to see what was up, and to find out why the Danish East India Company wasn't generating the wealth that the king was expecting. Upon his arrival, it didn't take long for Lale to figure out that the colony was woefully mismanaged. The previous governor hadn't exactly been doing a stellar job. Lale immediately got to work improving the situation, getting the colony's finances in order, and he also signed a treaty with the neighboring Indian leaders banning Danish ships from engaging in piracy. All of this may have improved the situation in Tranquebar, but it also earned William Lale his fair share of enemies in the colony. There were a lot of people who didn't like this new guy showing up and changing things, not to mention putting an end to the profitable side hustle of piracy. The dissatisfaction eventually led to plotting, and in 1648, when Lale went on an inspection voyage, a conspiracy known as the Tranquebar Rebellion sprang into action. When he returned, Lale was arrested and officially replaced as head of the colony by the leader of the rebels, a man called Paul Hansen Corser. The surprised and outraged Lale was put on trial, accused of financial irregularities, which I have to say sounds an awful lot like projection on the side of the rebels. Even though Lale did what he could to defend himself, the result of the trial was a foregone conclusion. The rebels weren't interested in his defense. It's not even entirely sure they believed he was guilty. They just wanted him gone. So after this brief show trial, Lale was convicted and shipped off back to Denmark. Under Paul Hansen Corser's leadership, the Danish crown effectively lost control over Tranquebar and piracy promptly resumed. When Willem Lale returned to Copenhagen, he was eager to clear his name. And the new king, Frederick III, was more inclined to listen to what he had to say than the rebels in Tranquebar had been. The case against Lale was soon thrown out due to a lack of evidence, and instead, King Frederick listened closely to his account of what was going on in Danish India, and eventually dispatched a frigate to resume control over the colony. So Lale was vindicated, even though he never returned to India, since he died shortly thereafter in Copenhagen. In future years, the Tranquebar colony would thrive, not least under Frederick IV. Trade between Tranquebar and Denmark was extremely profitable, and the Danish Asian Company, which had a monopoly on this trade for many years, made loads of money from it, especially during the years of almost constant war in the late 18th and early 19th century. The Danish trading colonies made serious money. Denmark did what it could to stay out of the conflicts and remain neutral, and thanks to that attitude, they could continue to trade with everyone. The Danish colonies in India were also important for various British and French pirates in the Indian Ocean, who were not neutral, but could operate discreetly under a neutral Danish flag when fighting each other. As we saw last time, though, Frederick IV wasn't just concerned with money. He was also keenly interested in spreading Christianity, and not the kind of Christianity that the Jesuits had been teaching the Tamil locals since before the Danes showed up. In the early 1700s, Frederick IV sent Protestant missionaries to Tranquebar. Among them was a German called Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg, who translated the whole Bible into the Tamil language. In 1714, he had his Tamil version of the New Testament printed using a printing press that they'd brought over from Europe for the purpose of spreading the word of God to the people of India. An unforeseen side effect of this particular printing press was a boost of the Tamil language. As I've mentioned on several occasions already, the translation and spreading of the Bible and other religious texts strengthened and standardized local languages all over Scandinavia after the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Now, this printing press had the same effect for the Tamil language. In the first 100 years after the Tranquebar printing press became operational in 1712, no fewer than 300 books were printed in Tamil. Eventually, the Danes ventured even further than Tranquebar. In the 1750s, they established another trading post just north of the city of Kolkata. This town, today known as Serampore, had the interesting hybrid name Frederiksnagor during the 3/4 of a century when it was a Danish colony. It was called that in honor of Frederick V, and he also gave the new, or perhaps I should say temporary, name to the Nicobar Islands when they were annexed by Denmark in 1756. These islands, located in the Bay of Bengal, quite far from both Tranquebar and Frederiksnagor, were renamed the Frederick Islands, and the colony New Denmark was established there. Missionaries were sent to New Denmark to spread the Danish brand of Protestantism among the natives. The colony didn't survive long, though, and soon illness and attacks from hostile locals forced the colonists who survived to reconsider the project. A few stayed on, but repeated waves of malaria outbreaks eventually forced even the most committed missionaries to recognize this climate wasn't for them. As you may imagine, the Frederick Islands were far from the most convenient or profitable colony out there, but the Danes held on to them, at least for a time, administering them remotely from Tranquebar. In the 1860s, the recently unified Kingdom of Italy expressed an interest in buying the islands from Denmark. Italy was late to the colonial game since the country only came into existence in the early 19th century, so I guess they had to try and take what they could get. Nothing came of it though, apparently due to palace intrigues in Rome, but to learn more about that, you'll have to find a podcast on Italian history, I'm afraid. Instead, the government in Copenhagen eventually sold the Frederick Islands to the British, who incorporated them into their colonial empire. This would eventually be the fate of all the Danish possessions on the Indian subcontinent. When the British control over India grew and tightened, the Danes were gradually squeezed out. In the early 19th century, it became clear that there was only one option: to sell the colonies to the British. But the negotiations dragged on until the mid-1800s, before also Tranquebar and Frederiksnagor became part of British India. By then, Tranquebar had lost much of its previous importance as a trading port, not least after another nearby port was connected to the growing Indian railway network. The Swedes also traded in the Far East, but they never established Asian colonies like the Danes did. But a few years after Christian IV had sent expeditions to establish Danish colonies in Greenland and India, the Swedes also decided to give colonialism a go. Unlike the Danes, they focused on a different part of the world, namely on the vast and largely unexplored continent today known as North America. You may have heard of it. Even though North America hadn't been properly explored yet, that doesn't mean it was unknown by any stretch of the imagination, or that no Europeans had settled there. The French, the English, and the Dutch had already started to make inroads into this new landmass. In fact, it was a Dutchman, a certain Peter Minuit, who initiated the Swedish colonization project in the 1630s. Peter Minuit had previously worked for his countrymen in North America, and it was even he who famously purchased the island of Manhattan from the natives for a ridiculously small sum. But Minuit had quarreled with his Dutch employers, and now he was looking to sell his services to someone else. some other country that would value his expertise and be willing to pay for it. Peter Minuit approached Axel Oxenstierna. Remember him? He was the power behind the throne during the reigns of both Gustavus Adolphus and Queen Christina. Minuit suggested to Oxenstierna that the Swedes should establish a colony on the Delaware River. Even though it wasn't all that far from where the English Puritans had landed with the Mayflower a few years before, the area around the river hadn't been permanently colonized by other Europeans yet. In other words, it was still up for grabs. Axel Oxenstierna loved the idea. He hoped that a Swedish colony in the New World would open up new markets and lead to new incomes. And if you remember the episodes about Swedish involvement in the 30 Years' War, you remember that Sweden was in constant need of money at the time. In 1637, the New Sweden Company was established and granted a monopoly on tobacco imports to Sweden. The funding for the project came from both Dutch and Swedish investors. Among the Swedes, we find Axel Oxenstierna himself, as well as his brothers and a cousin of theirs. That summer, preparations were made to send 2 ships to the Delaware River and establish a colony there. Everything was done in secret, since the people behind the New Sweden Company knew that the English, the Dutch and the French wouldn't like the Swedes showing up in the New World, and they would probably do what they could to stop them from succeeding. For that reason, it was of crucial importance to have the colony up and running, or at least properly defended, before the others had a chance to react. When the ships left Gothenburg in November 1637, there were 22 cannons, 24 Swedes, and 24 Dutchmen on board. There were no women or civilian settlers included in this first voyage, only sailors and soldiers who'd set up the colony and defend it. They brought with them supplies and tools to build the first houses, and wares like combs, mirrors, fabrics, pipes, rings, axes, and knives they assumed they could use to barter with the locals. The plan was to first secure the colony and then bring over civilians to expand and create a functioning society. Axel Oxenstierna dreamed that this first colony eventually would swell into an empire in the New World, from Newfoundland in the north to Florida in the south. Obviously, that was a crazy idea, completely disconnected from reality, which may surprise you since Axel Oxenstierna is known for being realistic and the guy who poured cold water on Gustavus Adolphus's grandiose plans of Swedish domination over Europe. I guess it shows you how little was known about North America and Sweden in the 1630s. They certainly didn't have any reliable maps of the area they hoped to colonize. Back in those days, maps of the New World weren't something you could just buy if you wanted one. They were still considered valuable secrets and regarded jealously. The 2 Swedish ships got into trouble even before they reached America. They almost didn't make it at all. More or less as soon as they had left Gothenburg, they ran into one of those dreaded storms that plague the North Sea in the fall and winter months. The ships got separated and drifted helplessly on the sea for weeks. Only in December they finally managed to find each other and a Dutch port where they could repair the ships and get ready for another attempt. On December 31st, they set sail across the Atlantic. They eventually reached the Delaware River in March 1638. They sailed up the river until they reached a little peninsula created by 2 other streams uniting and flowing into the Delaware. Today, the bigger of those streams is still called Christina River, after Queen Christina of Sweden. The smaller is called Brandywine Creek, after the Swedish word for vodka, brännvin. The Swedes called this place Paradise Peninsula. They were amazed by the lush plant life, the colorful birds, and the exotic fruits they had never tasted before, such as watermelon. But not all was well in Paradise. They also encountered less pleasant animals like snakes and skunks, which the Swedes called fart cats. The colonists had instructions from Stockholm to establish peaceful relations with the natives, to trade with them, and to purchase land from them. On this land, they were to build a fort and raise the Swedish flag. Then, half of them should continue to Florida and do the same there. When this goal was achieved, the ships should return to Sweden loaded with goods from the New World, preferably tobacco. Already 6 days after their arrival, they managed to buy land. a 100-kilometer-long strip of the western bank of the Delaware River. They called this colony New Sweden, and Peter Minuit became its first governor. There, they built a fort called Fort Christina on a little hill close to the water. Then they went to Jamestown to trade goods for tobacco, but the English governor refused, referring to the English monopoly on the tobacco trade. But the trip to Jamestown wasn't a complete waste of time. They returned to Fort Christina with a freed slave called Antony. In New Sweden, he would soon be known as Antony Svart, or Antony Black. He was hired because he knew both how to grow tobacco and how to navigate the local rivers. Soon, he had a small tobacco patch going inside Fort Christina. Eventually, the ships returned to Sweden to bring settlers to populate New Sweden. One ship sailed from Fort Christina loaded with furs of beaver and bear, but no tobacco. The second ship first made a detour to the Caribbean to get tobacco they'd be able to sell in Sweden to cover their expenses. Peter Minuit was in charge of that ship, and even though they did manage to buy tobacco, Minuit himself actually drowned in a tropical storm. New Sweden had to wait 2 years before ships arrived from home with supplies and news. In that time, there were only 20 soldiers, the temporary governor and Antony Svart, living at Fort Christina. The ship that eventually arrived in 1640 brought everything New Sweden could possibly need: settlers, soldiers, supplies, cattle, horses, and, of course, a priest. Life in New Sweden was tough, as it always is in new colonies. They lacked almost everything: weapons, ammunition, and a scribe who knew Latin, which was needed to communicate with the English and the Dutch neighbors. Another thing the colony lacked was people. It was tricky to get Swedish peasants to move across the Atlantic. To increase the population, deserters and prisoners were given the choice to evade prison if they went to New Sweden instead. There, they had to work for the company for a few years, after which they were free to go back or buy land in New Sweden. Most chose to stay and buy land. The colony also grew through land purchases from the Dutch. In the end, it reached all the way to present-day southern Pennsylvania, western New Jersey, and parts of Maryland. Settlements like New Stockholm and Swedesboro were established, and New Gothenburg, which was the administrative center of the colony. On the whole, the Swedes enjoyed good relations with the local native tribes. That wasn't because the Swedes were nicer than the Dutch or the English, but because they were weaker. There were only a few hundred Swedes living next to thousands of natives. The Swedes were keenly aware of the power imbalance and tried their best not to upset their neighbors. There was one issue, though. The natives refused to become Christians, even Protestants. The colonists distrusted what they saw as the native devil-worshipping ways and the fact that they didn't dress modestly enough for the Swedish tastes. But despite their refusal to embrace Protestantism and clothes that cover their body, the natives weren't the most annoying neighbors. The English and the Dutch were a much bigger problem. They encroached on the Swedish colony from the mid-17th century onwards, and the Swedes could do little to stop them. It soon turned out that the Swedes had been smart to keep the whole colonization project a secret for as long as they could. As soon as the Dutch heard about New Sweden, they objected to the Swedes settling in what they considered their sphere of influence. But in 1638, the Dutch in America were too weak to do anything about the Swedes setting up shop along the Delaware River. But the Dutch were faster at building up their military strength than the Swedes were, and in the summer of 1655, a Dutch fleet consisting of 7 ships carrying 317 soldiers set sail from New Amsterdam, a city today better known as New York. Their objective was to take over New Sweden. The Swedes were unable to put up any effective defense against the Dutch, who proceeded to plunder houses and kill livestock throughout the colony. They went on to lay siege to Fort Christina, and on September 15th, 1655, the fort surrendered to the Dutch. This ended the Swedish colonial adventure in continental North America. New Sweden was incorporated into the Dutch colony, but the Swedes who chose to stay were allowed to keep what was left of their farms, have their own militia, practice their own brand of Christianity, and manage their own legal affairs. The Dutch triumph didn't last long though. Already 11 years later, the English conquered New Netherlands and took control over the whole northeastern seaboard. In the end, both Denmark and Sweden were far too small to hold on to their colonial possessions once the French and the British started to divide the world between them. Only Iceland and Greenland remained under the Danish crown, perhaps because no other colonial power thought it worthwhile to try and take them from the Danes. But that doesn't mean that the Scandinavian colonial projects had been failures. With a few exceptions, they made serious money for their respective mother countries for a few generations. And we haven't even talked about the settlements that brought in the most income yet. Next time, we'll focus on those more profitable colonies and the dark shadow that rests over them. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word among your co-workers, family members, and bridge partners who are also into colonial projects? Also, why not leave a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.